On the morning of May 9th, 1914, a gunshot echoed through a mansion in Santa Barbara, California. Charles William Post, one of the wealthiest men in America, had taken his own life. He left behind a serial empire worth $20 million. He also left behind a 27-year-old daughter who would transform that fortune into something far greater. Marjorie Post would become the richest woman in America. She would build palaces that rivaled European royalty. She would marry 4 times, each husband more powerful than the last. She would dine with Stalin's inner circle and rescue the treasures of murdered czars. She would sail the largest private yacht ever built and command a wilderness retreat with 68 buildings. But Marjorie was more than a collector of beautiful things and powerful men. She was a business pioneer in an era when women could not yet vote. She recognized the potential of frozen food before anyone else. She fed thousands during the Great Depression while wearing diamonds worth millions. She lived like an empress, but never forgot where she came from. This is the story of a woman who inherited everything and built even more. A woman whose homes became museums, whose yacht became a warship, and whose legacy still shapes American culture today. From a barn in Battle Creek, Michigan, to the glittering ballrooms of Palm Beach, Marjorie Post lived a life that seemed impossible. If you enjoy stories of American history and extraordinary wealth, please subscribe to support me and my channel. You will not want to miss what comes next. Her story begins with tragedy. Chapter 1. The Shot in Santa Barbara. By early 1914, Charles William Post had built one of the largest food companies in America. His products sat on breakfast tables from New York to San Francisco. Postum, grape nuts, Post Toasties. These names had made him fabulously wealthy. His advertising campaigns had revolutionized how Americans thought about breakfast. He employed thousands of workers in Battle Creek, Michigan. Yet the 60-year-old magnate could not escape the pain in his stomach. His health had troubled him for decades. Now, it was failing completely. In late 1913, he cancelled public appearances. The pain in his abdomen grew worse with each passing week. Doctors suspected appendicitis. In early March 1914, Post's condition became desperate. The president of the Santa Fe Railroad arranged a private train car to rush him from California to Minnesota. The destination was the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, where the famous Mayo brothers performed the most advanced surgeries in the country. The non-stop journey covered nearly 2,000 miles. William and Charles Mayo operated on Post sometime between March 5th and 10th. The surgery was declared a success. His appendix was removed. He was sent home to California to recover. But the pain did not stop. Something else was wrong. Something the surgeons had missed or could not fix. Post returned to his winter home in Santa Barbara with the same agony that had driven him to Minnesota. The man who had preached positive thinking and healthy living found himself unable to practice either. Depression settled over him like California fog. On the morning of May 9th, 1914, Charles William Post walked to his gun collection. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, he selected a rifle. He placed the weapon against himself, and he ended his suffering permanently. The news shocked the nation. Here was a man who had everything: fortune, fame, a beautiful daughter, a thriving company, yet he had chosen to leave it all behind. The newspapers printed lengthy obituaries praising his business genius and his innovations in advertising and cereal manufacturing. What they focused on most was his only child. Marjorie Post was 27 years old when her father died. She was already married to her first husband, Edward Bennett Close. She had 2 young daughters of her own. The inheritance was staggering. $20 million in 1914 had the purchasing power of well over $500 million today. But the money was almost secondary to the responsibility. Marjorie now controlled the Postum cereal company, one of the fastest-growing food corporations in America. She was suddenly one of the most powerful businesswomen in the country. In an era when women could not vote, could not serve on most corporate boards, could not even open their own bank accounts in many states. Her father had prepared her for this moment. Most fathers of that era taught their daughters needlepoint and piano. Charles Post had taught his daughter something else entirely. Now she would have to prove she had learned those lessons well. The funeral was held in Battle Creek on May 15th. Charles William Post was laid to rest in a magnificent granite mausoleum at Oak Hill Cemetery. The structure cost $100,000 to build. It contained 630 tons of Victoria white granite quarried in New Hampshire. The actual burial chamber sat 9 feet below the floor. Marjorie stood at her father's grave, knowing that everything had changed. She was no longer just an heiress. She was the owner of a company that would either grow or decline based on her decisions. The workers in Battle Creek depended on her. The shareholders depended on her. The legacy her father had built depended entirely on what she did next. To understand how she was ready for this moment, we must go back to the beginning. Chapter 2. The Apprentice from Battle Creek. Marjorie Merriweather Post entered the world on March 15, 1887, in Springfield, Illinois. The town had once been home to Abraham Lincoln. Now it was home to a restless inventor named Charles William Post and his wife Ella Letitia Merriweather. The Posts were not wealthy. Charles worked as a salesman and manufacturer of agricultural equipment. He had invented several farm implements, including a plow and a hay stacking machine. He held patents. He had ambition. But success kept slipping through his fingers. What Charles Post had in abundance was nervous energy. Too much of it. By his late 30s, he had suffered multiple breakdowns. His mind raced faster than his body could follow. Doctors of that era called it neurasthenia. Today we might recognize anxiety or depression. Whatever the diagnosis, the cure remained elusive. In 1891, when Marjorie was 4 years old, the family made a decision that would change American breakfast forever. They moved to Battle Creek, Michigan. Battle Creek had become famous for one thing: the sanitarium run by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. This eccentric physician believed that most human ailments stemmed from poor diet and insufficient bowel movements. He prescribed vegetarian meals, vigorous exercise, and daily enemas. Patients at his sanitarium ate strange grain-based concoctions that Kellogg himself had invented. They drank no coffee, no alcohol, no stimulants of any kind. Charles Post checked himself into the sanitarium hoping for relief. He got something better. He got an idea. Kellogg served his patients a coffee substitute made from roasted grains. Post tasted it and saw opportunity. If people would pay to drink this at a sanitarium, they might pay to drink it at home. He could manufacture the product himself. He could sell it to the millions of Americans who worried about the supposed dangers of coffee. Post left the sanitarium after a few months. His health had not improved much, but his entrepreneurial spirit had awakened. He briefly opened his own competing clinic called La Vita Inn, promising cures through mental suggestion. When that failed, he turned to the coffee substitute idea. In 1895, working in a small barn on the family property, Charles Post created Postum. The drink was made from roasted wheat bran and molasses. It tasted nothing like coffee. But Post was a genius at advertising, and he convinced Americans that coffee was poison. His advertisements were revolutionary for their time. One famous campaign asked readers, Is your yellow streak the coffee habit? Another warned that coffee would reduce your working force, kill your energy, push you into the big crowd of mongrels. The claims were outrageous. They were also extraordinarily effective. Within 2 years, Post needed a factory to meet demand. Within 5 years, he was a millionaire. Young Marjorie watched all of this unfold. She was 8 years old when her father launched Postum. She helped in the only way a child could. She glued labels onto the boxes in the family barn. She folded packaging. She witnessed the transformation of her family from struggling middle class to genuinely wealthy. Her father noticed something in his only child. She paid attention. She asked questions. She wanted to understand not just what he was doing, but why. In 1897, Post introduced his first breakfast cereal. He called it Grape Nuts, despite the fact that it contained neither grapes nor nuts. The name came from the grape sugar that formed during the baking process and the nutty crunch of the finished product. Like Postum, Grape Nuts succeeded through aggressive advertising. Post claimed it could cure appendicitis, malaria, and loose teeth. The Federal Trade Commission did not yet exist to challenge such assertions. By 1900, the Postum Cereal Company employed hundreds of workers. The factory complex in Battle Creek covered 20 acres. Charles Post had become one of the most successful businessmen in America, rivaling his former host John Harvey Kellogg and Kellogg's brother Will Keith, who had founded his own cereal company. The rivalry between Post and the Kelloggs became legendary in Battle Creek. Accusations of stolen recipes flew back and forth. Kellogg claimed Post had copied his formulas. Post insisted his innovations were entirely original. The truth likely lay somewhere in between. What mattered was that Battle Creek had become the cereal capital of the world, and the Post family stood at the center of it all. Marjorie turned 10 in 1897. That year, her father made an unusual decision. He began bringing her to board meetings. This was not done. Daughters of wealthy men learned music, languages, and social graces. They did not sit in rooms full of cigar smoke, listening to discussions about market share and distribution networks. But Charles Post had no son. He had only Marjorie. And he seemed determined to prepare her for something more than marriage. She sat quietly at first, absorbing the rhythms of corporate discussion. She learned the vocabulary of business, margins, inventory, accounts receivable. Terms that meant nothing to other girls her age became familiar to her. Her father began explaining his decisions during carriage rides home. Why had he agreed to that contract? Why had he rejected that supplier? What was the real reason behind the new advertising campaign? Marjorie listened and learned. By her early teenage years, she was touring the factories herself. She watched the workers on the production lines. She saw how the cereals were mixed, baked, and packaged. She understood the logistics of shipping products across the country. She knew which rail lines were reliable and which caused delays. In 1901, at age 14, Marjorie left Battle Creek for Washington, D.C. Her father enrolled her at Mount Vernon Seminary, a finishing school for young women of means. She would learn the social skills expected of her class. But she would not forget what her father had taught her. The years at Mount Vernon Seminary polished her manners without dulling her mind. She traveled to Europe with her father during school breaks. They visited factories and met with business contacts. While other wealthy Americans toured cathedrals and museums, Charles Post showed his daughter how commerce worked on the international stage. In 1904, Post introduced another product, a cornflake cereal he initially called Elijah's Manna. Religious groups protested the name, and several countries refused to import it. Post renamed it Post Toasties. The serial became another enormous success. By now, Marjorie was 17. She had grown into a striking young woman with sharp eyes and an easy confidence. She had also grown into something rarer, a woman who understood business from the inside. Her father's company was worth millions. His personal fortune continued to expand. He had built a model town for his workers in Texas, complete with houses sold to employees on favorable terms. He had experimented with creating rain through dynamite explosions in the dry Texas panhandle. He had diversified into real estate and land development. Through it all, Marjorie remained his closest confidant. She knew his secrets, his strategies, his fears. She knew that his health continued to trouble him despite his public image of vitality. She knew that he worried about what would happen to his empire after he was gone. He was preparing her. Whether consciously or not, Charles William Post was training his daughter to take his place. In an era when women were expected to marry well and manage households, he was creating something unprecedented, a female business executive. Marjorie did not know that her father had less than a decade to live. She did not know that she would inherit everything at 27. She only knew that he was teaching her, and she was learning. The lessons would prove more valuable than any inheritance. Chapter 3. The War That Changed Everything. Marjorie Merriweather Post met Edward Bennett Close at a party in New York sometime around 1904. She was 17, freshly polished by Mount Vernon Seminary. He was 22, a graduate of Columbia Law School, and a member of one of Greenwich, Connecticut's established families. Close was handsome in the manner of that era. Dark hair, serious eyes, an air of old money respectability. His family had no fortune to compare with the Posts, but they had something Charles Post's millions could not buy. Generations of social acceptance. The Closes belonged. The Posts, despite their wealth, were still newcomers. For a young woman navigating the complex hierarchy of American high society, Edward Bennett Close offered legitimacy. For a young lawyer with expensive tastes, Marjorie Merriweather Post offered security. Whether love entered the equation remains unclear from the historical record. What is clear is that both families approved of the match. The wedding took place on December 3rd, 1905, in New York City. Marjorie was 18 years old. The ceremony was grand, but not ostentatious. Charles Post, ever the businessman, understood that displays of excessive wealth could generate unwelcome attention. The newlyweds settled into the life expected of their class. Edward practiced law. Marjorie managed their household and continued her education in the social arts. She learned which families mattered in New York, which clubs required membership, which charities demanded patronage. She hosted dinners and attended balls. She became, by all appearances, exactly what her father had not raised her to be, a society wife. But she never stopped visiting Battle Creek. Throughout her first marriage, Marjorie maintained her connection to the Postum cereal company. She attended board meetings when possible. She reviewed financial reports. She kept her hand in the business, even as she performed the rituals of upper-class domesticity. Edward Close seemed unbothered by this arrangement. Perhaps he understood that his wife was not ordinary. Perhaps he simply did not notice. Their first daughter arrived on July 22nd, 1908. They named her Adelaide. The following year, on December 3rd, 1909, a second daughter was born, Eleanor. Marjorie now had everything a woman of her era was supposed to want: a respectable husband, beautiful children, unlimited wealth, a place in society. The marriage was not happy. The specific grievances have been lost to discretion and time. Marjorie rarely spoke publicly about her first husband in later years. What survives are hints and silences. Edward Close appears in photographs, but seldom in anecdotes. He exists in the historical record as a legal fact, rather than a living presence. By 1914, the marriage had settled into something functional but hollow. Then two events shattered whatever equilibrium remained. In May, Marjorie's father killed himself in Santa Barbara. She inherited $20 million and control of a major corporation. Overnight, she became one of the most powerful women in American business. Her husband remained a moderately successful lawyer. In August, war erupted in Europe. The Great War, as it was then called, seemed impossibly distant at first. Fighting in Belgium and France had nothing to do with breakfast cereals or New York society. America declared neutrality. Life continued. But Marjorie could not ignore what she read in the newspapers. The casualties were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of young men were dying in trenches. The wounded overwhelmed military hospitals. Medical supplies ran short. Doctors worked without adequate facilities. She decided to act. In 1916, while America still debated whether to enter the conflict, Marjorie began organizing. She worked with the Red Cross to establish a base hospital that could serve American troops if and when they arrived in France. She did not simply write a check. She threw herself into the logistics of medical care on a massive scale. The project consumed her. She recruited doctors and nurses. She arranged for equipment and supplies. She navigated military bureaucracy and shipping schedules. She applied the same organizational skills her father had taught her, the same attention to detail that had made Postum cereal successful. When America finally entered the war in April 1917, two things happened to the Close family. Marjorie's hospital preparations accelerated toward completion, and Edward was called into military service. He reported for duty as a captain and was soon sent to France. There he would see active combat, earning a battlefield promotion to major. The French government would later award him the Médaille d'honneur des Affaires étrangères for his service. Meanwhile, Marjorie's base hospital number 15 opened in Savonay, France, in the summer of 1918. The facility could accommodate 2,460 patients simultaneously. It was one of the largest American military hospitals in Europe. Marjorie had funded much of its construction and equipment personally. She traveled to France to see the hospital in operation. She walked the wards. She spoke with wounded soldiers. She witnessed firsthand the cost of the war that newspaper headlines could only suggest. Somewhere in France, her husband was fighting. Somewhere else in France, her hospital was saving lives. The couple served the same cause from opposite ends of the same catastrophe. The experience changed her. Marjorie returned to America with a new understanding of what her wealth could accomplish. She had built something that mattered. Not a company that sold breakfast cereal, but a place where broken men were put back together. The satisfaction was different from anything she had known. Edward came home a decorated war hero in late 1918. He had served with distinction. He had earned a French medal. By any measure, he had proven himself in ways that his pre-war legal career never demanded. It was not enough. During the months he spent in the trenches, Marjorie had grown increasingly independent. She had moved through Manhattan's sophisticated circles. She had proven she could organize a massive enterprise without her husband's help. She had discovered capabilities within herself that domestic life had never demanded. The young society wife who had married Edward Close in 1905 no longer existed. The death of Edward's mother in July 1919 did not help matters. Whatever bonds still held the marriage together finally broke. The divorce was finalized in November 1919. The terms were private. Marjorie retained custody of Adelaide and Eleanor. Edward Close would remarry the following year to Elizabeth Taliaferro, with whom he would have 2 sons, including William Taliaferro Close. Through that second marriage, Edward Bennett Close would become the grandfather of actress Glenn Close. Marjorie was 32 years old. She was divorced, which still carried social stigma in 1919. She was the mother of 2 young girls. She was also the owner of a major corporation, a proven philanthropist, and a woman who had discovered she needed more than society could offer her. The decade ahead would test everything she had learned. Chapter 4. The Man Behind, when E.F. Hutton Talks. Edward Francis Hutton had buried his first wife less than 3 years earlier. Blanche Horton Hutton died on December 18, 1917, swept away by the Spanish influenza that was killing millions around the world. They had been married for 17 years. Their only son, Halcourt, was 15 years old when his mother died. Hutton was 44 when he met Marjorie Merriweather Post, wealthy beyond measure and still grieving. He had built one of the most successful brokerage firms in America. In 1904, he and his brother Franklin had founded E.F. Hutton and Company with a vision of bringing Wall Street to the rest of the country. While other firms focused on New York, Hutton opened offices in California and across the nation. He pioneered the use of telegraph and telephone to execute trades from distant cities. By 1920, his firm was the second largest brokerage house in the United States. Marjorie Merriweather Post was 33 when she met Edward Hutton. She was freshly divorced from her first husband. She owned one of the largest food companies in America. She had 2 young daughters and a fortune that dwarfed most men's egos. What she saw in Hutton remains a matter of speculation. He was not conventionally handsome. He was nearly a decade older than her, but he understood business in ways her first husband never had. He moved in the highest circles of American finance. He knew how to grow companies, how to structure deals, how to turn millions into tens of millions. Perhaps she also saw a man who had suffered, a man who understood loss, a man who might appreciate what he had rather than taking it for granted. They married on July 7, 1920, less than a year after her divorce from Edward Close. The wedding was quiet by the standards of their wealth. Both had reasons for discretion. She was a divorced woman in an era when divorce still carried stigma. He was a widower, still adjusting to life without Blanche. Tragedy struck again, just weeks after the wedding. On September 25, 1920, Halcourt Hutton was killed in a horse-riding accident on Long Island. He was 18 years old. Hutton had now lost both his first wife and his only son within 3 years. Marjorie stood by her new husband through his grief. Whatever else would happen in their marriage, she was there when he needed her most. The marriage began as a partnership. Hutton understood that his wife was not merely a rich woman who had inherited a company. She was a trained executive who had studied business since childhood. She knew the Postum cereal company from the factory floor to the boardroom. She had opinions about strategy, acquisitions, and expansion. Unlike many husbands of that era, Hutton listened. In 1922, Hutton took Postum public, listing shares on the New York Stock Exchange. The move brought fresh capital for expansion. It also brought scrutiny from shareholders who expected growth. The following year, he became chairman of the Postum Board of Directors. Marjorie and Hutton delivered. Throughout the 1920s, Postum acquired company after company. Jell-O, the gelatin dessert that had become an American staple. Baker's Chocolate, which had operated the first chocolate mill in America back in the 1700s. Maxwell House Coffee, with its famous slogan that Teddy Roosevelt had supposedly coined when he declared the brew good to the last drop. Hellmann's Mayonnaise, Log Cabin Syrup, Calumet Baking Powder, Minute Tapioca. Each acquisition followed the same logic that Charles William Post had explained to his daughter years before. Find successful brands. Buy them. Apply superior distribution and advertising. Watch the profits multiply. The Huttons lived accordingly. In 1922, they built Hillwood, a Tudor revival mansion on 176 acres of Long Island. The house had dozens of rooms, immaculate gardens, and a staff of servants who kept everything running with invisible precision. But Marjorie wanted something grander still, something by the sea. On December 29th, 1923, she gave birth to her third daughter. They named her Nadania Marjorie Hutton. The child would grow up to become the actress Dina Merrill, though no one could have predicted that future in the nursery at Hillwood. The family now included 11-year-old Adelaide and 10-year-old Eleanor from Marjorie's first marriage. Hutton treated all three girls as his own. He was, by most accounts, a devoted stepfather and father. Whatever tensions existed in the marriage would not become apparent for years. Meanwhile, the acquisitions continued. The most important one began with a frozen goose. Sometime in the mid-1920s, the Huttons set sail from Gloucester, Massachusetts, on their yacht. The crew had provisioned the ship with food for the journey, including a goose that seemed remarkably fresh and flavorful when served at dinner. Marjorie asked questions. Where had this goose come from? How had it stayed so fresh? The answer led her to Clarence Birdseye, a local inventor who had developed a revolutionary process for freezing food. During years spent in Labrador, Birdseye had observed how the Inuit flash-froze fish in the extreme cold. The fish, when thawed months later, tasted almost fresh. Birdseye had figured out how to replicate this process industrially. Marjorie immediately saw the potential. Frozen food could transform how Americans ate. It could make seasonal foods available year-round. It could reduce waste. It could change everything. She urged Hutton to buy Birdseye's company for $2 million. Hutton hesitated. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. American homes did not have freezers. Grocery stores did not have freezers. Delivery trucks did not have freezers. The entire infrastructure for frozen food distribution would have to be built from scratch. Marjorie persisted. This was the future. She was certain of it. The argument continued for years. Meanwhile, Birdseye's asking price rose. Other potential buyers circled. The window of opportunity seemed to be closing. Finally, in early 1929, Hutton agreed. Postum acquired Birdseye's General Seafood Corporation and its patents for approximately $22 million. The price was more than 10 times what Marjorie had originally proposed, but she believed it was worth every penny. In June 1929, the Postum cereal company changed its name. It became the General Foods Corporation, adopting the name of its most recent and most transformative acquisition. The company was now the largest food conglomerate in America. Its brands sat in virtually every pantry in the country. Marjorie Merriweather Post had transformed her father's coffee substitute company into an empire. She had done it with her second husband's help, his financial expertise, his Wall Street connections. The partnership had worked brilliantly for business. But business partnerships and marriages are not the same thing. The decade ahead would reveal the difference. Chapter 5. The Palace Between Sea and Lake. The first house Marjorie built in Palm Beach was too small. In 1921, she and Edward Hutton had constructed a modest villa called Hogarcito on a lot near the Everglades Club. The name meant Little Hearth in Spanish. The house was pleasant enough, designed by the respected Palm Beach architect Marion Sims Wyeth, but it sat on a golf course rather than the ocean, and it could not accommodate the scale of entertaining that Marjorie had in mind. She wanted something grander, something that would rival the great estates of Europe, something that would announce to the world that Marjorie Merriweather Post had arrived. In 1924, she found the perfect location. A narrow strip of land stretched between the Atlantic Ocean to the east and Lake Worth to the west. The property sat on a coral reef ridge, the highest natural elevation in Palm Beach. From this spot, one could see water in every direction. The name practically wrote itself: Mar-a-Lago, Spanish for sea to lake. The land cost practically nothing. By most accounts, Marjorie paid around $100 for the 17-acre parcel during the Florida land boom. The construction that followed would cost considerably more. Marjorie retained Marion Sims Wyeth as the primary architect. Wyeth was a Princeton-educated professional who had studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had designed many of the finest homes in Palm Beach and understood the Spanish Mediterranean revival style that dominated the island. His plans called for a sprawling complex organized around a curved central courtyard with separate wings for family quarters, guest rooms, and entertaining spaces. But Wyeth's rational academic approach did not fully satisfy Marjorie. She wanted something more theatrical, something that would feel like walking onto a stage set rather than entering a house. For this, she turned to Joseph Urban. Urban was an Austrian-born designer who had made his name creating spectacular sets for the Metropolitan Opera and the Ziegfeld Follies in New York. He understood how to manipulate space and light to create emotional responses. He knew how to make rooms feel magical rather than merely elegant. He had never designed a private residence, but that did not matter to Marjorie. She wanted his vision. The collaboration between Wyeth and Urban was uneasy from the start. Wyeth designed the floor plans and the structural elements. Urban transformed the interiors and exterior decorations into something that defied conventional architecture. The Beaux-Arts trained Wyeth reportedly regretted his involvement with the project and rarely discussed it afterward. He preferred buildings that followed established rules. Mar-a-Lago followed no rules except those that Marjorie and Urban invented together. Construction took roughly 4 years to complete. Planning and site preparation began in 1923, with the major building phase running through 1926. Over 600 workers labored on the site at various stages of the project. Approximately 300 craftsmen came from Europe, bringing skills that had been passed down through generations of artisans. The materials alone told a story of obsessive perfectionism. 3 boatloads of Doria limestone arrived from Genoa, Italy. This fossil-bearing stone was chosen because it aged rapidly, giving the new construction an appearance of antiquity. Skilled carvers shaped the stone into intricate bas-reliefs featuring griffins, acanthus leaves, and fantastical creatures. Marjorie acquired a collection of nearly 36,000 antique Spanish tiles that had been assembled decades earlier by Mrs. Horace Havemeyer, whose family had made their fortune in sugar refining. Some of these tiles dated back to the 15th century and showed the influence of Moorish craftsmen who had once ruled Spain. The collection was believed to be one of the largest of its kind in the world. These tiles covered the entrance hall, the cloisters, the patio, and numerous rooms throughout the house. 20,000 roofing tiles came from old Cuban buildings, their colors ranging from salmon pink to weathered red. Another 2,200 square feet of black and white marble arrived from a castle in Cuba to floor the dining room. Native cypress trees were sand-blasted to give the beams and columns a weathered appearance that suggested centuries of use. Joseph Urban traveled to Vienna to recruit the sculptor Franz Barwig and his son to create the decorative figures that would populate the estate. For nearly 3 years, the Barwigs carved parrots, monkeys, and other creatures from the Doria stone. Their work gave Mar-a-Lago a whimsical quality that distinguished it from the more serious mansions of the Gilded Age. The completed house rose from the coral ridge like a vision from a fairy tale. A 75-foot tower dominated the skyline, offering panoramic views of both ocean and lake. The main residence contained 58 bedrooms and 33 bathrooms. The living room stretched 1,800 square feet beneath ceilings that soared 42 feet overhead. Every bathroom featured gold-plated fixtures, which Marjorie explained were easier for the servants to clean than silver or chrome. The house was designed to accommodate multiple generations and purposes simultaneously. Family quarters occupied one wing. Guest accommodations filled another. The public entertaining spaces could handle hundreds of visitors, while the private areas remained secluded. A covered passage connected the main house to a separate guest cottage across the entrance drive. Urban designed each bedroom suite with its own distinct personality. The Adams suite evoked colonial America. The Dutch suite featured Delft tiles that Marjorie's mother had particularly loved. The Spanish suite showcased porcelain figurines of ladies-in-waiting arranged in niches around a tiled fireplace. The Venetian suite glittered with crystal chandeliers. For her young daughter Nedania, Urban created the baby house suite with a fairy tale theme, complete with pink roses climbing up a beehive fireplace screen and door handles shaped like squirrels. The final cost reached $7 million, equivalent to well over $100 million in current purchasing power. The figure did not include the art and antiques that Marjorie would continue acquiring for decades to fill the rooms. Edward Hutton was reportedly dismayed by the escalating expenses and complained to friends that building estimates were not worth the paper they were written on. Mar-a-Lago opened in January 1927. That March, the Huttons hosted an elaborate dinner party before the annual Everglades costume ball. The guests arrived to find their hosts dressed as members of the French court during the reign of Louis XVI. The evening announced to Palm Beach society that a new standard of entertaining had been established. The house was designed to withstand hurricanes, a wise precaution in South Florida. The walls were constructed of hollow ceramic tile 16 inches thick, covered with reinforced stucco and plaster. The foundation rested on concrete pilings driven into the coral reef. 3 bomb shelters were built into the structure, reflecting the anxieties of an era that had recently witnessed World War. Marjorie intended Mar-a-Lago to serve as her winter residence for the rest of her life. She and Hutton would typically arrive in mid-January and remain until late March. The house required a permanent staff of 60 people, 30 to run the household, and 30 to maintain the grounds. The property included a 9-hole golf course, elaborate gardens with fountains and statuary, and enough open space to host a circus. She hosted exactly that on at least one occasion, inviting the entire Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to perform on the grounds for charity. Underprivileged children from the area were invited to attend alongside Palm Beach society. Mar-a-Lago represented something new in American architecture. It was neither the academic classicism of the great Newport cottages, nor the romantic historicism of the great estates along the Hudson River. It was theatrical in a specifically 20th century way, designed to create experiences rather than simply display wealth. Every room was a stage. Every vista was composed for maximum emotional impact. The house also represented the peak of Marjorie's partnership with Edward Hutton. They had built an empire together. They had built a palace together. Everything seemed possible in early 1927. Within a few years, everything would begin to change. Chapter 6. The largest private sailing ship in the world. Mar-a-Lago was magnificent, but it was stationary. Marjorie wanted something equally impressive that could move. The Huttons had owned a succession of yachts, all with black hulls and all named Hussar. By 1929, Marjorie decided the next vessel would surpass anything they had owned before. She wanted the largest private sailing yacht in the world. Edward commissioned the project from the Krupp Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel, Germany. The specifications were staggering: 316 feet in length, 4 towering masts carrying 29 sails, a main mast rising 178 feet above the waterline. The cost approached $1 million. The Depression had already begun, but the Huttons proceeded anyway. Marjorie took personal responsibility for the interiors. She enrolled in a course on marine engineering to understand the technical constraints of shipboard design. In a Brooklyn warehouse, she had the outline of each cabin drawn on the floor at full scale, then arranged her carefully selected furnishings within those boundaries until every piece found its perfect position. The yacht was christened Hussar Fifths and launched in April 1931. A crew of 72 would maintain and operate the vessel. The interiors rivaled any European palace. Marjorie's personal suite featured white Carrara marble in the fireplace and bathroom, with water fixtures shaped like golden swans. Edward's cabin offered pink Carrara stone and a generous walk-in closet. Throughout the ship, rare pieces from auction houses in Paris and Vienna filled every space. Murano chandeliers hung in the main salon. Venetian mirrors reflected the light from brass fittings polished to a gleaming finish. The Huttons spent at least 6 months of each year aboard Hussar Fifths, sometimes 9. Their 1932 voyage alone covered more than 16,000 miles, from Cuba to Panama to the Galapagos and back through the Caribbean. They cruised to Tahiti, Alaska, the Mediterranean. Aboard the yacht, Marjorie could entertain royalty and business leaders against the backdrop of endless ocean horizons. The isolation of the sea provided privacy that even Mar-a-Lago could not guarantee. But the marriage that had produced Hussar 5 could not survive the 1930s. By 1935, evidence of Edward's infidelities had accumulated beyond Marjorie's tolerance. The couple divorced. Unlike many such arrangements among the wealthy, Marjorie emerged with the yacht. She promptly renamed it Sea Cloud, symbolizing a fresh start, and had the black hull repainted white. Just 3 months after her divorce, Marjorie married Joseph Edward Davies, a Washington lawyer and diplomat. The marriage would prove her most consequential in terms of historical significance. Davies was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1936. Sea Cloud sailed to Leningrad, where it served as both residence and floating embassy. Marjorie entertained Soviet officials aboard the ship, bringing capitalist luxury into the heart of communist Russia. Queen Elizabeth of Belgium later came aboard when Davies was posted to Brussels. The pleasure yacht had transformed into a diplomatic instrument. When World War II erupted, the market for luxury yachts collapsed. Marjorie tried to sell Sea Cloud and found no buyers at any price. After Pearl Harbor, she offered the vessel to the Navy. President Franklin Roosevelt initially refused, saying the yacht was too beautiful to sacrifice. Eventually, he relented. The Navy stripped away the masts, painted the hull battleship grey, and mounted anti-submarine weapons on deck. Renamed IX-99, the former pleasure yacht became a floating weather station in the North Atlantic. Marjorie said that since she had no son to give to the war effort, she would give her ship instead. The yacht's most significant wartime contribution involved neither weather nor submarines. In late 1944, Lieutenant Carlton Skinner proposed an experiment. At that time, black seamen could serve only as stewards. Skinner requested permission to crew Sea Cloud with a fully integrated complement. The request was approved. 50 black sailors, including 2 officers, served aboard the former yacht. They passed 2 fleet inspections with no deficiencies. Sea Cloud became the first racially integrated warship in the United States military since the Civil War. Marjorie received her yacht back after the war. The vessel went through several subsequent owners before German businessmen restored it in 1978. It still sails today as a cruise ship, more than 90 years after its launch. Marjorie's original suites remain largely intact. Travel publications have described Sea Cloud as the most romantic sailing ship afloat. But in 1935, all of that lay far in the future. Marjorie had divorced one husband and married another. She had renamed her yacht and repainted its hull. She was preparing for the adventure that would define the next phase of her life. Joseph Davies was about to become the American ambassador to Soviet Russia, and Marjorie was about to begin collecting treasures that no other American had ever been permitted to acquire. Chapter 7. The Diamonds in the Drawer. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. Within weeks, fortunes that had taken generations to build vanished overnight. Men who had considered themselves masters of the universe found themselves ruined. Some jumped from skyscrapers rather than face what came next. Marjorie watched the catastrophe unfold from a position of relative safety. General food stock declined, but did not collapse. People still needed to eat, and the company sold food. Her fortune contracted, but remained intact. She was still one of the wealthiest women in America. That security made what she saw around her even more disturbing. Tent cities appeared in Central Park. Unemployed men lined up for hours, hoping for a few hours of work. Families who had once lived comfortably now struggled to feed their children. The contrast between her life and theirs became impossible to ignore. Marjorie owned multiple mansions, a yacht, and one of the most valuable jewelry collections in the country. Millions of Americans could not afford bread. She made a decision that shocked her social circle. Marjorie cancelled the insurance policy on her jewelry collection. The premiums alone cost a small fortune. She locked the diamonds, the emeralds, the Marie Antoinette earrings, and the Napoleon tiara in a bank vault. Then she took the money she saved and put it towards something else entirely. In partnership with the Salvation Army, she opened the Marjorie Post Hutton canteen in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan. This was not a soup kitchen in the traditional sense. Marjorie believed that people who had fallen on hard times deserved dignity along with their meals. The canteen served food in a comfortable environment where women and children could eat without shame. 1,000 people received meals there every day from 1930 to 1935. Marjorie did not simply write checks and disappear. She personally supervised the operation. She showed up to inspect the facilities. She made sure the food met her standards. The woman who hosted dinner parties for European royalty now concerned herself with whether hungry New Yorkers were being treated with respect. At Christmas, she took things further. Marjorie bundled herself in a rain jacket and boots and stood on a Manhattan street corner ringing a Salvation Army bell. The richest woman in America, asking strangers for spare change to help the poor. No photographers were invited. No reporters recorded the scene. She did it because she believed it mattered. Her efforts extended beyond the canteen. She sponsored a massive charity ball at Madison Square Garden. She led fundraising campaigns for the Salvation Army Women's Emergency Aid Committee. She served on unemployment relief committees that coordinated assistance across New York State. Some of her peers thought she had lost her mind. The wealthy were supposed to insulate themselves from unpleasantness, not wade into it. Charity was acceptable in the form of gala donations and named buildings. Standing on street corners was something else entirely. But Marjorie understood something that many of her fellow millionaires did not. Her father had built his fortune selling breakfast cereal to ordinary Americans. Those same ordinary Americans had made her rich. She felt an obligation to them that went beyond writing checks to the opera. The depression also clarified her thinking about her marriage. Edward showed little interest in her charitable work. While she stood on street corners and supervised soup kitchens, he continued his usual routines. Their priorities had diverged completely. The marriage that had seemed like a perfect partnership in the 1920s had become a source of quiet misery. Marjorie kept up appearances, but those closest to her understood that something fundamental had broken. The contrast between her public generosity and her private unhappiness created an unsustainable tension. She had locked her diamonds in a drawer to help strangers. Her own husband seemed incapable of similar sacrifice. By 1935, she had reached a decision. The marriage would end. The jewelry would eventually return to her neck and wrists, and she would embark on an entirely new chapter of her life with an entirely different kind of man. Joseph Davies was waiting. Chapter 8. Bells, Silk Thread, and Talcum Powder. Marjorie suspected the truth long before she could prove it. The signs were subtle at first. Edward's absences grew longer. His explanations grew thinner. He seemed distracted even when physically present. The man who had once shared her passion for building an empire now seemed to have passions directed elsewhere. She could have looked the other way. Many women in her position did exactly that. A divorce among the wealthy was messy, expensive, and humiliating. The newspapers would feast on every detail. Friends would take sides. The children would suffer. Far easier to maintain appearances and find consolation in one's own pursuits. But Marjorie was not built for willful blindness. She was her father's daughter, trained from childhood to identify problems and solve them. If her husband was betraying her, she wanted proof. New York divorce law at the time recognized only one ground for ending a marriage: adultery. Suspicion was not enough. Unhappiness was not enough. Even mutual agreement to separate was not enough. A wife seeking divorce had to demonstrate that her husband had committed a specific act of infidelity with a specific person at a specific time and place. Marjorie set her traps with methodical precision. She attached small bells to doors and windows throughout the house. Any nocturnal movement would produce a telltale sound. She stretched silk threads across hallways at ankle height, so fine as to be nearly invisible. Anyone walking through in darkness would break the thread without noticing. She sprinkled talcum powder on floors to capture footprints. The target of her surveillance was not some society beauty or Broadway actress. It was her own live-in maid. Edward had been conducting an affair under his wife's roof, with a woman employed to serve her household. The betrayal was not merely personal. It was an insult to everything Marjorie had built. The traps worked. The threads broke. The powder showed footprints leading where they should not have led. The bells rang in the night when they should have remained silent. Armed with evidence, Marjorie filed for divorce in 1935. The grounds were adultery. The proceedings were handled as quietly as wealth and good lawyers could manage, but rumors still circulated through Palm Beach and Manhattan society. Edward did not contest the divorce. He understood that Marjorie had the evidence she needed and the resources to deploy it effectively. Fighting would only prolong the humiliation and increase the damage to both their reputations. The settlement left Marjorie with virtually everything that mattered. She kept Mar-a-Lago. She kept the yacht. She kept her controlling interest in General Foods. She kept custody arrangements that favored her for their daughter Nadania. Edward walked away with his brokerage firm and whatever dignity he could salvage. Within a year, Edward married Dorothy Metzger, a woman 32 years his junior who had recently divorced her own husband. He remained married to her for the rest of his life. Marjorie moved faster. Just 3 months after her divorce became final, she married Joseph Edward Davies. He was 59 years old, a prominent Washington lawyer with connections throughout the Democratic Party. He had known Marjorie for years through mutual friends and political circles. The speed of the remarriage raised eyebrows. Some whispered that the relationship had begun before the divorce. Others suspected that Marjorie simply could not bear to be without a husband, that her identity required a man's name attached to her own. The truth was probably simpler. Marjorie was 48 years old. She had wasted years in a marriage that had turned hollow. She saw no reason to waste additional years in mourning for something that deserved no grief. Davies offered something Edward never had. He moved in political circles that fascinated her. He had the ear of President Franklin Roosevelt. He understood power in ways that went beyond money. And Roosevelt was about to offer Davies an assignment that would change the course of Marjorie's life. The American embassy in Moscow needed a new ambassador. Chapter 9. The Ambassador's Wife. They arrived in Moscow on January 19th, 1937. The train from Berlin had taken 2 days and 2 nights across Poland and into the Soviet Union. At the Belarus station, the entire staff of the American embassy waited on the snow-covered platform alongside Soviet Foreign Office officials and a swarm of photographers. Marjorie stepped off the train arm in arm with her new husband, the flashbulbs popping in the frozen air. She was 50 years old. She was beginning her 3rd marriage. And she was about to take up residence in one of the most dangerous capitals on Earth. The American ambassador's residence was called Spaso House, a grand mansion built in 1914 for a wealthy merchant named Nikolai Vitorov. The Bolsheviks had seized it after the revolution. Now it served as the residence for American ambassadors, its 82-foot main hall crowned by a domed ceiling and an enormous crystal chandelier believed to be the largest house chandelier in Moscow. Marjorie looked at the place and saw what needed fixing. She and Joseph paid for extensive renovations out of their own pocket. They rewired the entire house. They installed American bathtubs. They brought in their own furniture and tableware. And they arranged for monthly shipments of frozen delicacies from America, allowing Marjorie to entertain Soviet officials in a style Moscow had not seen since before the revolution. Her role was to serve as hostess, and she understood instinctively that hospitality was diplomacy by other means. At formal dinners in Spaso House, she paired French and Russian porcelain with pink and yellow orchids. She seated Soviet commissars next to Western diplomats with careful attention to protocol and personality. She created an atmosphere of warmth and elegance that made the grim realities outside the embassy walls seem temporarily distant. The simple men of the Soviet government and their wives had never experienced anything like it. 5-hour luncheons featuring champagne and caviar, menus that rivaled the finest restaurants in Paris. A hostess who treated them with grace and genuine interest, despite representing everything their revolution had supposedly destroyed. The Soviets responded in kind. They liked the Davieses. They appreciated the frank and unapologetic capitalism, the absence of any pretense at sympathizing with communist ideology. These were rich Americans who made no secret of being rich Americans, and somehow that honesty made them easier to deal with than diplomats who mouthed progressive platitudes. But the hospitality came with surveillance. Marjorie discovered microphones hidden throughout Spaso House, in the fireplaces, in the ventilation shafts, in the walls between rooms. Embassy staff instructed her to tap a spoon on metal or glass whenever discussing anything sensitive, the noise disrupting the listening devices. Guests received welcome cards, warning that every room was monitored by the Soviet secret police and that their luggage could be searched multiple times daily. The domestic staff reported to Soviet intelligence the Davies family was followed wherever they went. In one photograph from this period, Joseph and Marjorie walk along a snow-covered road lined with birch trees, dressed elegantly as always, while a GPU car waits a short distance behind, its occupants making no effort to conceal their purpose. Beyond the embassy walls, something terrible was happening. Stalin's Great Purge was consuming the Soviet Union. Former revolutionaries who had helped create the communist state were being arrested, tortured into confessions, and executed as traitors. The show trials unfolding in Moscow's Hall of Columns featured old Bolsheviks confessing to impossible crimes, plotting to assassinate Lenin, conspiring with Nazi Germany, attempting to restore capitalism through sabotage and espionage. Joseph Davies attended these trials as an official observer. Chiefs of mission received limited tickets, and he watched as men who had shaped Soviet history stood before the court and proclaimed their own guilt. In January 1937, he observed the trial of 17 defendants, including Karl Radek and Yuri Pyatakov. In March 1938, he witnessed the final show trial, featuring Nikolai Bukharin and 20 other defendants charged with crimes that defied reason. Davies accepted the confessions as genuine. This would later become the most controversial aspect of his ambassadorship. Career diplomats at the embassy, including George Kennan, were appalled by what they saw as willful blindness. They recognized the trials as theatrical productions, the confessions extracted through torture and threats against family members. Davies disagreed. He reported to Washington that the trials were legitimate, that the defendants were genuinely guilty, that the Soviet system was capable of defending itself against internal enemies. His book about the experience, Mission to Moscow, would sell 700,000 copies and be adapted into a Warner Brothers film. It would also be denounced by historians and diplomats for decades as dangerously naive propaganda. Marjorie kept her own counsel. She focused on her role as hostess. She supported the Red Cross. She explored Moscow's museums and antique shops, and she began noticing something that would change the trajectory of her collecting forever. The Soviet government was selling off the treasures of the Tsars. Churches had been looted. Noble estates had been confiscated. Imperial palaces had been stripped of their contents. The revolutionary government needed foreign currency, and it had warehouses full of Romanov silver, Fabergé eggs, porcelain from the imperial factories, icons dripping with gold and gems. Much of it was available for purchase at prices that seemed almost impossible. Marjorie began to buy. She had always collected beautiful things. But Russia offered something different, the material culture of an entire civilization, sold off by the destroyers of that civilization to anyone with hard currency and the means to ship it out. Every purchase was a rescue. Every crate that left the Soviet Union preserved something that might otherwise have been melted down or destroyed. She did not yet understand how vast her collection would become, or how it would eventually find its permanent home. That understanding would come later, after she returned to America, after her third marriage ended like the others, after she finally created the museum that would bear her name. For now, she was the ambassador's wife. She hosted dinners. She navigated surveillance. She watched her husband report on show trials whose victims would later be rehabilitated and whose judges would be exposed as participants in one of history's great crimes. And she filled crate after crate with the treasures of Imperial Russia. In June 1938, Joseph's Moscow assignment ended. He had been appointed ambassador to Belgium. They departed for Brussels, leaving behind the microphones and the watchful eyes of the secret police. The purge continued without them. The men who had confessed so eloquently to crimes they never committed lay in unmarked graves. and Marjorie carried with her the beginnings of what would become the most important collection of Imperial Russian art outside Russia itself. Chapter 10. The Tsar's Treasures for Sale. The revolution had been efficient in its confiscations. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they inherited the accumulated wealth of 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Imperial palaces filled with porcelain and gold, churches dripping with icons framed in silver, noble estates containing paintings and furniture acquired across generations, the homes of merchants and aristocrats furnished with Fabergé creations commissioned as Easter gifts and anniversary presents. The new government had no use for such bourgeois extravagance, but it desperately needed foreign currency. Beginning in the 1920s, the Soviet state began selling off the treasures it had seized. The sales were conducted through government agencies with names like Antiquariat, through commission shops open only to foreigners, through backroom storerooms where confiscated items accumulated in dusty heaps. Paintings from the Hermitage went to Andrew Mellon. Jewels from the Diamond Fund were auctioned in European capitals. The material culture of Imperial Russia flooded onto the international market at prices that bore no relation to artistic or historical value. An American businessman named Armand Hammer recognized the opportunity before almost anyone else. He had come to Russia in 1921, ostensibly to provide medical relief, and stayed for nearly a decade. He manufactured pencils. He sold tractors. And when the Soviet government forbade him from exporting his ruble profits, he negotiated permission to convert his earnings into antiques. Hammer and his brother Victor shipped Romanov treasures back to New York by the hundreds. They opened the Hammer Galleries on Fifth Avenue. During the Depression, when traditional art buyers had vanished, they pioneered the radical technique of selling through department stores. Russian icons and Fabergé eggs appeared in the display cases of Lord & Taylor, marketed as exotic curiosities from the vanished world of the Tsars. By the time Marjorie arrived in Moscow, the state-sponsored sales were winding down. The most spectacular pieces had already left the country. The Hammer brothers had moved on to other inventory. The Soviet government had extracted what foreign currency it could from the destruction of its own cultural heritage. But surprising discoveries remained. Marjorie explored the commission shops and government storerooms with the same systematic determination she brought to everything. She found silver chalices tarnished beyond recognition, being sold by weight rather than artistry. She discovered heaps of church vestments in neglected back rooms, embroidered in gold thread and studded with pearls, treated as worthless fabric rather than sacred objects. She located icons that had survived centuries in Orthodox churches, now stacked carelessly against walls in warehouses where no one understood what they represented. Joseph became intrigued first. Something about the solemn faces painted on those wooden panels captured his attention, and his enthusiasm ignited Marjorie's appreciation. Together they began acquiring icons that would eventually form one of the finest small collections in the United States. A pair of royal doors with their canopy still attached. Icons of St. George and the Old Testament Trinity. Objects that had been stripped from churches and left to moulder in state custody. Marjorie understood that she was witnessing cultural destruction on an unprecedented scale. The revolutionary government was not merely selling art, it was liquidating the visual record of Russian civilization, converting centuries of religious devotion and imperial patronage into hard currency for industrialization. Every icon melted for its silver frame was a loss that could never be recovered. Every porcelain service sold to foreigners was a piece of Russian history permanently exiled. She bought, compulsively, porcelain from the Imperial Porcelain Factory, pieces that had graced the tables of Catherine the Great and her successors. silver drinking vessels crafted by master goldsmiths whose workshops had been shuttered by the revolution, enameled objects in the distinctive Russian style that combined Byzantine tradition with European technique. Chalices that had held communion wine in churches now converted to warehouses or demolished entirely. She had begun collecting Fabergé even before she understood Russian art. In 1926, she purchased an amethyst quartz box that appealed to her taste for finely crafted objects. It seemed merely an extension of her love for French gold boxes. 5 years later, her daughter Eleanor gave her something far more significant: the Catherine the Great egg. This was one of the legendary imperial Easter eggs that Peter Carl Fabergé had created for the Romanov family. Tsar Nicholas II had presented it to his mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, on Easter morning in 1914. It was a masterwork of pink enamel and four-color gold, decorated with miniature allegorical scenes of arts and sciences, set with diamonds and pearls. Inside had been a mechanical surprise: a tiny sedan chair carried by two figures, with a miniature Catherine the Great seated within. Wind it up, and the figures walked. The surprise had been lost before the egg left Russia. Stalin's government had sold the egg to Armand Hammer for 8,000 rubles. Hammer resold it in 1931. Eleanor purchased it as a birthday gift for her mother. Marjorie displayed it in the room she was already planning to dedicate to Russian treasures. The collection grew beyond anything she had anticipated. Nearly 90 Fabergé pieces would eventually join the Catherine the Great egg. 60 Russian porcelain dining services featuring dishes commissioned by empresses. 25 silver religious chalices. The nuptial crown that Empress Alexandra had worn at her wedding to Nicholas II in 1894. A diadem of diamonds that had adorned the last Tsarina on the day she became the wife of the last Tsar. Only about 20% of her Russian collection came directly from her time in Moscow. The rest she would acquire over the following decades, purchasing at auctions and from dealers and private collectors who had bought during the Great Soviet sell-off. But those 18 months transformed her understanding of what she was collecting and why it mattered. She was not merely assembling beautiful objects. She was preserving fragments of a civilization that had been deliberately dismantled. Every piece she acquired was a piece that would not be melted down, would not disappear into private hands, never to be seen again, would not be lost to the historical record. She was building an archive of Imperial Russia in exile. The collection she assembled during her Moscow years would grow for decades afterward. She purchased at auctions in New York and London. She acquired pieces from dealers who specialized in Russian decorative arts. She tracked down objects that had passed through multiple hands since leaving the Soviet Union. But the foundation was laid in those dusty storerooms and commission shops, where a woman with American dollars could rescue fragments of a vanished empire. She did not yet know where the collection would find its permanent home. That decision lay 2 decades in the future, after her life took turns she could not anticipate. For now, she was simply a collector following her instincts, preserving what she could from a catastrophe whose dimensions she was only beginning to understand. It would have to be enough. Chapter 11. 68 buildings in the wilderness. She called it a rustic retreat. The property sat on a narrow ridge of sand and gravel, a geological formation called an esker, rising between the Spectacle Ponds and Upper St. Regis Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. 12 miles northwest of Saranac Lake, accessible only by water when Marjorie first acquired it in 1920, the site offered something none of her other properties could provide: genuine isolation from the social demands that consumed her life everywhere else. She bought the land and immediately began transforming it into something that defied the word rustic in every conventional sense. By 1923, Camp Topridge had grown to 68 buildings spread across 207 acres. The main lodge alone contained an 80 by 100-foot living room with 25-foot ceilings. An adjoining dining room seated 30 guests. Multiple fireplaces large enough for a grown man to stand inside dominated the great room. The construction used local Adirondack logs and fieldstone, materials that suggested wilderness simplicity while supporting a structure of baronial grandeur. Guests did not arrive by automobile. There was no road. They flew into Saranac Airport aboard Marjorie's private Vickers Viscount, an airplane she had named the Merryweather after her mother's family. From the airport, they were driven to a private dock and ferried across the lake by launch. At the boathouse, they could either climb the stairs up the steep ridge or ride a covered 6-person funicular that Marjorie had installed for her Aunt Molly, whose heart condition made the climb impossible. The funicular delivered them to a world unlike anything else in the Adirondacks. Each guest received a private cabin equipped with its own fireplace, a fully stocked bar, a bathroom for every bedroom, and a telephone connected to the main lodge. Each cabin came with its own butler. A system of call buttons allowed guests to summon with a touch of a finger whatever service they required. A boatman, a masseur, a tennis partner, a fishing guide, a private secretary. The main season ran from mid-July through Labor Day. During those weeks, 85 staff members operated the compound: cooks and maids, caretakers and guides, gardeners and boat crews. They arrived from Keys Mills Road, parked in a distant lot, and walked an unpaved path to the workers' side of the camp. They lived in separate buildings, invisible to guests, except when summoned. 3 times each week, the living room became a private cinema. Full-length films were screened for whoever happened to be visiting. The guest lists over the years read like a directory of American power: General George C. Marshall, architects of victory in the war that was coming; Prince Felix of Luxembourg; Madame Nehru; politicians and diplomats, industrialists and military commanders, anyone Marjorie deemed worthy of her hospitality and interesting enough to merit the journey. The decor reflected her eclectic tastes and her collector's instinct for the unusual. Wooden Indians stood alongside stuffed animals. Eskimo kayaks hung from walls near mounted trophies from deep-sea fishing expeditions. Antlers had been entwined into elaborate light fixtures. Settees were covered with animal hides. The collection of Native American artifacts eventually became so significant that much of it would be donated to the Smithsonian Institution. Some items were more disturbing: authentic scalps, a deck of playing cards reportedly made from human skin. Marjorie displayed them without apparent discomfort, curiosities from a frontier era that had ended before she was born, artifacts of a violence she had never witnessed but found historically compelling. After she returned from Moscow, she added something new to the compound. A Russian dacha rose among the Adirondack pines, a log structure in the traditional style of Russian country houses, complete with onion domes that seemed transplanted from the Orthodox churches she had visited. Inside, a Russian tile stove provided heat during the cool mountain evenings. The building served as a retreat within a retreat, a private space where she could surround herself with memories of that strange sojourn in Stalin's capital. The dacha also represented something she rarely acknowledged publicly: the gap between her life and the lives of the people whose treasures she had acquired. A dacha in Imperial Russia had been the summer home of aristocrats and wealthy merchants, families whose descendants now lived in exile or lay in unmarked graves. Building one in the Adirondacks was an act of nostalgia for a world she had witnessed only in its final liquidation. Topridge evolved continuously throughout her ownership. She acquired additional acreage over the decades: 1 acre in 1924, 85 acres in 1938, 118 acres in 1957. The compound grew to encompass the ridgeline and the shorefront, the ponds and the forests, creating a private wilderness within the larger wilderness of the Adirondack Park. The property had originally been called Topridge, a name that combined her second husband's surname with the geographical feature on which it sat. After her divorce, she changed it to Topridge. The new name erased any association with Edward while retaining the essential fact of the site's topography. It was a small act of revision, but it mattered. Names carried weight. Names defined ownership. And Topridge belonged to her alone. She maintained the camp for over 50 years, visiting every summer, hosting guests who understood that an invitation to Topridge was an invitation into Marjorie's most private world. Her other properties were stages for public performance, Mar-a-Lago for Palm Beach Society, the Washington House for diplomatic entertaining, the New York apartment for business and culture. Topridge was different. Topridge was where she went to escape the obligations that came with being Marjorie Post. The escape was never complete. Staff still attended her every need. Guests still arrived expecting to be impressed. The call buttons still summoned services at a touch, but here at least, she could walk forest paths without photographers. She could watch films in her living room without society columnists noting who sat beside her. She could be, as much as her fortune allowed, simply a woman in the woods. She would eventually leave Topridge to the state of New York, imagining it might become a retreat for governors, a conference center for public servants, a gift to the people of the state that had allowed her family to build its fortune. Whether the state would prove capable of maintaining what she had built was a question she would not live to see answered. The funicular would continue to climb the ridge. The Darker would stand among the pines. The view across Upper St. Regis Lake would remain as it was when Marjorie first saw it and decided that this wilderness required 68 buildings to make it habitable. She had called it rustic. She had meant something else entirely. Chapter 12. The Daughter Who Chose Hollywood. She was born Dina Marjorie Hutton on December 29, 1923, the only child of Edward and Marjorie's marriage. The name honoured both grandmothers. By the time she reached adulthood, she would abandon both names entirely. Her childhood unfolded across properties that most Americans could only imagine. Winters at Mar-a-Lago, with its 126 rooms overlooking the Atlantic. Summers on the Sea Cloud, the four-masted sailing yacht that was then the largest privately owned vessel in the world. School years divided between a Fifth Avenue triplex in Manhattan and the sprawling estate on Long Island. Every material comfort a child could desire surrounded her from birth. Her parents divorced when she was 11 years old. The year was 1935, and the bells and silk thread and talcum powder had done their work. Dina stayed with her mother, watched her father remarry within the year, watched her mother remarry within months. The lesson was clear. Marriages ended, fortunes continued. Life in the upper reaches of American society went on despite personal upheaval. She attended Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, the same institution that would later produce Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. After graduation, she enrolled at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where her stepfather, Joseph Davies, had important political connections, and where her mother expected her to study something practical. She lasted 1 year. The problem was that Dina wanted to be an actress. Her father wanted her to study law and run for Congress. Her mother saw acting as a profession for people without better options. Neither could understand why a young woman with unlimited resources would want to spend her evenings pretending to be someone else for the entertainment of strangers. But Dina wanted something that belonged to her alone. something she had earned rather than inherited. She enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City and studied under Uta Hagen, one of the great acting teachers of the 20th century. She took modeling jobs at Vogue magazine for $10 an hour, even though her father's investments had made her a millionaire before her 18th birthday. When asked why she would work for such wages, she replied that her ambitions were her own and not exactly the ones her parents had for her. On the advice of a brother-in-law, she changed her name. She would not trade on Hutton, would not leverage the instant recognition that came with her father's brokerage advertisements. Instead, she chose Merrill, the surname of Charles E. Merrill, her father's colleague and competitor on Wall Street. The founder of Merrill Lynch would have appreciated the irony, E. F. Hutton's daughter borrowing his name to distance herself from E. F. Hutton. Dina Merrill made her Broadway debut in 1945, speaking 3 lines in a production called The Mermaids Singing. She was 21 years old, and she was exactly where she wanted to be. Her mother was not pleased. Years later, Dina would describe what happened next as brainwashing. Marjorie convinced her daughter that a proper woman married well and raised children. Acting could wait. Social position could not. In 1946, Dina quit the stage and married Stanley Rumbow Jr., heir to the Colgate-Palmolive fortune, a Marine who had served as a White House aide. She turned down a 7-year film contract. She turned down a picture with Clark Gable. She turned down everything she had worked for. A decade passed. 3 children arrived: Nedania, David, and Stanley III. The marriage to Rumbow provided social stability atop the wealth she already possessed. But the desire to perform never disappeared. After her daughter was born, Dina returned to modeling and accepted invitations to appear on television. Dick Powell brought her to Hollywood for guest spots on his anthology series. She was in her 30s before she finally stepped in front of a movie camera. Her film debut came in 1957, playing one of the eager young research assistants who work for Katharine Hepburn in Desk Set. The role was small, but it established what Hollywood would want from Dina Merrill for the next 4 decades: elegance, refinement, and an effortless portrayal of breeding. She did not have to act like an aristocrat. She was one. In Operation Petticoat, released in 1959, she played one of a group of Navy nurses stranded on a submarine commanded by Cary Grant. Grant had once been married to her cousin Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, whose multiple marriages and declining fortune had made her a tabloid fixture. In Butterfield 8, she played the long-suffering wife whose husband cheats on her with Elizabeth Taylor's character. Taylor won an Academy Award for the film. Dina received the role she was born to play, the dignified woman betrayed, maintaining composure while her private world collapsed. Her first marriage ended in 1966 after 20 years. Within months, she married Cliff Robertson, an actor who would later win an Academy Award. They appeared together on the television series Batman, playing a pair of Western-themed villains named Shame and Calamity Jan. It was perhaps the most unlikely role of her career, and she seemed to enjoy the absurdity of it. Through it all, she maintained her philanthropic commitments. When her son David was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes at 13, she channeled her energy into founding the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. She served on the board of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, and dozens of other cultural institutions. She was her mother's daughter in this respect. Privilege carried responsibilities. Her son David died in a boating accident in September 1973, just weeks before his 24th birthday. His body was recovered from the waters of Gardiner's Bay off eastern Long Island. The tragedy occurred during a period that would bring other endings to the family, other losses that would reshape everything Marjorie had built. But that story belongs to a later chapter. Dina Merrill continued acting into her 80s, appearing in over 100 film and television productions across 6 decades. She and her third husband, Ted Hartley, acquired the venerable RKO Pictures studio in 1989 and worked to revive its legacy. The girl who had wanted something of her own had built exactly that: a career, a body of work, an identity separate from the name she had been given at birth. She inherited a substantial portion of her mother's estate, including the responsibility for Mar-a-Lago. When the federal government declined to maintain the property as a National Historic Site, Dina and her sisters eventually sold it. The buyer was a real estate developer named Donald Trump, who paid $7 million in 1985 for an estate her parents had spent millions building and maintaining. The daughter, who had rejected her family name, ended up as the executor of its most visible legacy. The performance and the reality had become so intertwined that separating them was no longer possible. Chapter 13. The Photographs by the Pool. The third marriage ended the way the first two had ended, in a courtroom. Joseph Davies died on May 9, 1958, 3 years after Marjorie had obtained her freedom in Idaho. She had testified that he possessed a funny lack of basic straight thinking that was awfully hard to live with. She mentioned that he constantly accused her of making passes at other men. What she did not mention was simpler and sadder. She had taken up square dancing in 1950, and Joseph had never learned how. Their famous waltz partnership at Washington dinner parties could not survive her new enthusiasm. After 20 years together, they had simply grown apart. Davies kept Tregoron, the Washington estate they had shared. Marjorie purchased a new property called Hillwood, also in Washington, where she could display the Russian art collection that the settlement had divided between them. She was 67 years old, alone for the first time in decades, and determined not to remain so. Within weeks of Joseph's death, she remarried. Herbert Arthur May was 65 years old, a Pittsburgh industrialist who had served as executive vice president of Westinghouse. He was a man of considerable accomplishment, a patron of the Pittsburgh Civic Opera, a passionate supporter of the ballet, and the former master of foxhounds at the Rolling Rock Hunt Club in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. His first wife had died of pneumonia in 1937, leaving him to raise 3 sons and an adopted daughter. For 20 years, he had remained a widower. He was also, by all accounts, an exceptionally handsome man. At 71, Marjorie remained keenly interested in handsome men. The wedding took place in June 1958, a lavish affair befitting her status as one of the wealthiest women in America. The union was a disaster from the beginning. Herbert had his own fortune, his own properties, his own social standing. He was not a man who could be easily dominated, and Marjorie had grown accustomed to dominating. He enjoyed alcohol and insisted on extending the brief cocktail hour at Mar-a-Lago that she had maintained for decades. She had always limited the time guests could spend drinking before dinner to approximately 15 minutes. Herbert wanted more. But alcohol was not the fundamental problem. The photographs surfaced sometime during their years together. They showed Herbert at the pool at Mar-a-Lago, unclothed, in the company of younger men. The images were explicit enough to support a blackmail attempt. Someone had captured evidence that Herbert preferred the company of men in ways that his wife had not anticipated. According to people close to the family, Herbert complained to friends about the arrangement in terms that left little doubt about his preferences. He found his wife's physical expectations exhausting. The disparity between what she wanted and what he could offer had become impossible to bridge. The revelation devastated Marjorie. She had survived Edward Hutton's affair with a household servant. She had endured Joseph Davies's accusations and eccentricities, But this was something different. This was a humiliation she could not have imagined when she accepted Herbert's proposal. What made it worse was learning that her own daughter had known. Dina Merrill, according to accounts that emerged later, had been aware of Herbert's proclivities before the wedding took place. She had not warned her mother. The reasons for her silence remain unclear. Perhaps she believed her mother would not listen. Perhaps she thought the union would succeed, despite Herbert's preferences. Perhaps she simply did not know how to have such a conversation with a woman who had spent her entire life controlling every aspect of her world. The proceedings concluded in 1964. They had been together 6 years. Marjorie handled the aftermath with characteristic pragmatism. When Herbert suffered a stroke, she paid his medical bills. She provided him with an apartment in Fort Lauderdale where he could live comfortably. She maintained contact with his children, who had done nothing wrong and who had no reason to suffer for their father's deceptions. Herbert died in March 1968 at the age of 76. After the legal matters were settled, Marjorie made a decision that revealed how deeply the experience had affected her. She reclaimed her maiden name. For the rest of her life, she would be known as Marjorie Merriweather Post. Not Close, not Hutton, not Davies, not May. Just Post. The name her father had given her. The name that had meant something before any of the men came along. She was 77 years old. She had walked down the aisle 4 times. She would not do so again. The remaining years would be devoted to the things that had always mattered most: her properties, her collections, her philanthropy, her role as a hostess. She entertained at Mar-a-Lago and Hillwood and Camp Topridge. She supported the National Symphony and the Kennedy Center and the Boy Scouts and the Salvation Army. She lived as she had always lived, surrounded by beautiful objects and attentive servants and guests who appreciated the privilege of her hospitality. But something had changed. The photographs by the pool had revealed what 4 trips to the altar had failed to teach her. That money could not purchase honesty, that social position could not guarantee intimacy, that even the most careful due diligence could not protect against the secrets people carried. She had spent her life building an empire of beauty and order. The last man had reminded her that some things could not be controlled. Chapter 14. A Museum for the Nation. She had always known what she wanted her life to mean. In 1955, weeks after her 3rd marriage ended, Marjorie purchased a 25-acre estate in northwest Washington called Arbormont. The property bordered Rock Creek Park, the largest privately held land in the capital. The mansion contained 36 rooms in the Georgian colonial style. The previous owner had been Daisy Blodgett, wife of a Michigan lumber tycoon. Marjorie renamed it Hillwood, after the Long Island estate she had sold to become a university. She hired the architect Alexander McIlvaine to gut the interior and rebuild it according to her specifications. The library doors were repositioned to frame a view of the Washington Monument. The renovations took a year. In May 1957, she welcomed her first guests. 2 months later, on the 4th of July, she hosted her first large party. Hillwood quickly earned a reputation as one of Washington's most extraordinary private residences. But Marjorie had not purchased Hillwood to throw parties. She had purchased it to build a museum. The collection she had assembled over 4 decades now filled every room. Russian imperial treasures dominated. Fabergé eggs, chalices from the Orthodox Church, portraits of the Romanovs, porcelain from the imperial factories, a chandelier from the Catherine Palace that hung in her breakfast nook. French decorative arts occupied the formal rooms: Sèvres porcelain, Beauvais tapestries, furniture attributed to the great cabinet makers of the 18th century, jewellery that had belonged to Marie Antoinette and Empress Marie-Louise sparkled in custom-built display cases. She had acquired most of the Russian pieces during her years with Joseph Davies, when Stalin's government was selling off the treasures of the overthrown aristocracy to fund industrialization. Critics would later question the ethics of those purchases. Marjorie never wavered in her conviction that she had saved these objects from destruction. Without buyers like her, she believed, the Soviets would have melted down the gold and scattered the gems. By 1962, she had formalized her intentions. Hillwood would go to the Smithsonian Institution upon her death, along with a $10 million endowment to maintain it. The bequest came with conditions. The estate must remain exactly as she had arranged it, a time capsule of how one woman had lived surrounded by beautiful things. She established the Marjorie Post Foundation to ensure compliance. Any property used improperly would revert to the foundation's control. She made similar arrangements for her other holdings. Mar-a-Lago would go to the federal government as a retreat for presidents and visiting dignitaries. Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks would serve educational purposes. The Long Island property was already a university. Her jewelry would join the Smithsonian's collection. The National Symphony Orchestra, which she had supported for decades, would receive a substantial bequest. So would the American Red Cross, Mount Vernon College, and the C.W. Post campus of Long Island University. She was giving it all away, not to her daughters, who would inherit more than enough, to the nation that had made her fortune possible. The final years brought diminishment. By the summer of 1972, her memory had begun to fail. She required a wheelchair. The elaborate dinner parties grew smaller, then stopped entirely. The woman who had commanded rooms full of diplomats and industrialists now struggled to recognize familiar faces. Her grandson David had been diagnosed with diabetes at 13. Dina had responded by founding the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, channeling her energy into research and advocacy. David grew into a young man who spent summers in the Hamptons and winters in Palm Beach, part of the same privileged world that had shaped his grandmother's life. He was 23 years old in the autumn of 1973. On September 8th, David went out on Gardiner's Bay in a twin-engine racing boat. The seas were choppy. The boat capsized. David vanished beneath the water. 4 days later, on September 12th, Marjorie Post died at Hillwood of cardiac failure. She was 86 years old. She had outlived one husband, divorced 3 others, buried her parents and her stepmother, and seen her fortune grow from $20 million to $250 million. She had built houses that became landmarks and assembled collections that became museums. She had entertained royalty and presidents and movie stars. She had lived as though the Gilded Age had never ended, because for her, it never had. The day after her death, fishermen found David's body near Gardiner's Island. He had died 19 days before his 24th birthday. Grandmother and grandson were mourned together. Her will distributed $117 million among her 3 daughters. The charitable bequests totaled several hundred thousand more. But the true legacy was the property itself, the houses, the art, the gardens she had cultivated with the same precision she brought to everything else. The Smithsonian accepted Hillwood, but quickly discovered that the $10 million endowment produced only $450,000 in annual income, not enough to maintain the estate as Marjorie had specified. By 1975, the institution returned the property to the Post Foundation. Her daughter Adelaide opened the doors to visitors in 1977, fulfilling her mother's vision through private rather than government means. Mar-a-Lago proved even more problematic. Congress repealed acceptance of the estate in 1980, unwilling to bear the maintenance costs. The Post Foundation sold the property in 1985 to Donald Trump for $7 million, a fraction of what Marjorie had spent building it 6 decades earlier. Hillwood remains open to visitors today, exactly as Marjorie arranged it. The Fabergé eggs gleam in their cases. The Catherine Palace chandelier still hangs in the breakfast nook. The gardens bloom according to plans she approved. The docents explain how one woman turned a cereal fortune into a cultural institution. She had written, near the end, that she collected at first for the joy of it. Only later did she realize that the collection should belong to the country. The sentiment was genuine. So was the understanding behind it, that wealth on this scale carried obligations, that beauty preserved was beauty shared, that even the most private life could serve a public purpose. Marjorie Merriweather Post lies buried at Hillwood, in the gardens she designed, surrounded by the objects she loved. The museum she created draws visitors who never knew her name until they walked through her door. They come to see the Fabergé and the French furniture and the orchids in the greenhouse. They stay to learn about the woman who believed that magnificence was not a sin, but a responsibility. She had spent 86 years proving that belief. The evidence surrounds her still.